Hello, welcome to Connie Martinson Talks Books. Two things have changed our world. One, atomic nuclear weapons. The other, technology, satellites. Communication is instantaneous, and that works for governments as well as for businesses and even, I guess in a way, families. My guest today, Dr. Jean Lipman-Blumen, has written The Connective Edge, Leading in an Interdependent World. It's published by Jossey Bass, and we'll be back after a short pause.
Do you think you have the power to change the world?
I can change the world one child at a time.
I know I can make a difference in those children's lives.
I teach.
I teach.
Yes, they're teachers, but to the kids they reach, they're heroes.
I teach.
Do you have the power to wake up young minds, to be someone's hero? Teach, to make an impact on our future. Call 1-800-45-TEACH. Be a teacher. Be a hero.
We're talking with Dr. Jean Lipman-Blumen. She is co-founder and co-director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Leadership at the Peter F. Drucker Graduate Management Center in Claremont, California. Her book is The Connective Edge, Leading in an Interdependent World, published by Jossey Bass. Welcome, Dr. Blumen.
Very nice to be here.
Jean, let me ask you, when I said the world has changed, between nuclear weapons and instant satellite connections, how does this affect leadership?
It changes the fundamental conditions for leadership in the world, because in the past, leaders could make decisions in terms of how those decisions affected just their own group. And they didn't have to think about the effects on other groups. Now, because all of these groups worldwide are connected to one another, every decision that the leader makes, any leader makes, affects not only his or her group, but every group, every person, every organization around the globe.
So in other words, there's no way of really saying not in my backyard anymore.
Exactly. There is no such thing as an autonomous decision. When President Chirac, a few summers ago, decided to detonate nuclear weapons to test them in the South Pacific, he was acting as if this were 20 or 40 years ago, when he could make that kind of a decision and people would think he was acting like a very decisive leader. But instead, you remember what happened. There was a worldwide outcry, even in France, where the environmental movement has not necessarily been that strong. There were people marching in the streets of Paris in protest, and he had to save face. He had to back down after just one or two tests.
You'd say in the book that, in a way, an example of global connectiveness was the war in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, against Saddam Hussein. What happens, though, in America if we become, if a group of countries rose up against us?
Well, we would still have to deal with it in a similar fashion, because it really leadership right now relies on building coalitions, not permanent coalitions like we had in the 30s with the New Deal, or even the NATO coalition that lasted for 40 years, but temporary coalitions that come together to do a particular task, whether it's a war or a new product in a factory or whatever, and then go their separate ways.
You mentioned in the book about America's had three styles of leadership, being authoritarian, individual, and cooperative. The people who were of the 60s are now the new leaders. What do they bring from that era of the 60s, and what about competition?
I think they bring what I call stage 2 thinking from the 60s, where we were still locked into the idea that we were in control and that any leader individually could be in control and really didn't have to consult other groups or other organizations. And that's changed dramatically. Leaders can no longer just have a vision that is unconnected from other people and other groups. They have visions that they have to find ways to connect to the visions of others. And that's why I call the book The Connective Edge.
Jean, is there a problem, though, for the leader who is a connective edge leader? Doesn't it take more time? And does it mean that decisions are made by committee?
Well, it means that it is a far more democratic process. And Connie, you know, democracy is messy. It takes time, and it's not neat, but it's worth the struggle. And people feel that they are enfranchised. They have a part in the decision making. And when they feel that way, they're behind the leader all the way. When the leader imposes a decision, even though it may be objectively a wonderful decision, people only half-heartedly try to implement that decision.
It's interesting because many years ago I did a show with Andrew Grove from Intel, who had written a book, and he said that he had these open forums where people could criticize him. And I sort of looked askance. I didn't believe it. I couldn't see how a company would be successful that way. Little did I know. But he must have been what you call your stage 3 leader.
Well, I think he is. And he's certainly in an industry that focuses attention on the fundamental aspects of connective leadership, where things are connected, where there has to be connectivity, and yet there's enormous diversity. To have a leader address the issues of many different groups, whether they're employees in that individual's organization or whether they're constituents that make up the voting population in a particular political leader's district, the leader really has to be able to understand how all the different goals and agendas of these groups, how the different needs of all the participants somehow can come together and create not the lowest common denominator decision, but a decision that's better than anything any of the groups had anticipated before. So the connective leader raises the level of decision making and creates a consensus around a new and higher vision than any of the constituents had before, and probably even that the leader, him or herself, had before.
So in other words, this is called really giving away, in a sense, control over everything and trusting the people in a conglomerate sort of situation. Report to me how you're doing, but I don't have to know every step of the way.
Absolutely, and it's really a very interesting phenomenon. I call that aspect of connective leadership the entrusting dimension. And by that I mean that the leader entrusts the vision or the task to another person and doesn't care if that person really has had experience doing that particular thing before. Of course, the leader doesn't pick just anybody off the street. The leader picks somebody in the organization who has been selected and for the organization, and presumably has the qualities that he or she can draw upon to do the task. But the interesting thing is that the leader entrusts it to the other person and only sets 2 demands. One, that it be legal, that the implementation strategy be legal and ethical. And other than that, no holds barred. And an interesting thing happens. People who are treated that way by leaders at first oftentimes feel a little bit anxious because maybe they never did that task before. But then something very interesting happens. They reach very deep into themselves and touch well springs of creativity and resourcefulness and intelligence and ingenuity that they never knew they had before.
How does this, everything in business, there are two things. One, in government, it's the bottom line is peace and prosperity, but I guess the same works for business. How does this affect bottom line business?
Well, I think it has a very direct effect on bottom line business, because when people in organizations, for-profit organizations, feel that their ideas really are part of the very makings of the organization, they have a very different attitude toward what they're doing. They feel that what they're doing is important. For example, we've talked for many decades about participative management. And in the Connective Edge, I give participative management a hard time because I think it's essentially been phony. That we've said, we want you to participate. We want you to say what you think is good or bad. But in fact, what has been the case up until recently is that those people were allowed to say, and I say allowed to say, whatever they wanted. But then, once they got done saying it, then they were expected to fall into line behind what management already had thought about in the first place. And that's very different from really shaping the ideas and the product and the strategy of an organization. When you're involved authentically in that way, you know it.
Okay, because how do you know the difference? If you are second tier down and you have a leader saying, I trust you, and then suddenly pulls the rug from under you, or expects you to be a team player, but that means don't question what I'm saying.
Those leaders who operate that way are not connective leaders. It's that simple. They are still in what I call stage 2, or 40 years ago. And those leaders who entrust understand that sometimes the product won't be perfect, that there will be mistakes, because innovation requires risk. Risk means you will have mistakes. You won't always succeed. But if you don't create the conditions under which people feel safe to try new things, to do things they've never done before, there will be no innovation in that organization, and that directly affects the bottom line.
So it really would be shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations there.
Very much so.
Jean, talk too about how unions have fit into the workplace in America.
Well, unions have had a difficult time, I think, right now. They're probably at lowest ebb. Lower ebb than they have ever been in the past. And I think that part of what happened to unions was that somewhere they lost their vision and they lost their leadership, in the sense that they had leaders who, instead of putting the well-being of the workers and the cause of unionization above everything else, put their own power and their own wealth and success above everything else. And I think that there was a fundamental shift in the way that the people began to look at their constituents, at union membership. They didn't see that they were there to make the union better or to help the worker. They saw the worker as being the method by which they would ensconce themselves in powerful and wealthy positions.
Jean, we're going to take a short pause. When we come back, we also talk about different styles. I mean, not all Connective Edge leaders are going to have the same style. How large variation is allowed in that style, and who do you learn it from? We'll be back after a short pause.
Frogman Team Bravo, proceed to dive point. Check your gear. You will swim to Point Alpha. Your course is 220 degrees. Adjust for tide. Your depth is 10 feet. Current is
We can enjoy a peaceful summer day
ready. Dive.
because they're out here keeping that peace. The men and women of the Navy, out here today, safeguarding your tomorrow.
Okay, Bravo, come on ashore.
We're talking with Dr. Jean Lipman-Blumen, author of The Connective Edge, Leading in an Interdependent World, published by Jossey Bass. Jean, before the break, I mentioned about styles. Now, I know for 10 years, you, as part of in the Drucker Institute, did a study on leadership and styles from 84 to 95.
That's right. And we had some very interesting findings from that. We studied approximately 8,000 men and women in corporate America at the mid-level and senior levels of management. And we saw some very interesting findings. First, that leaders are beginning to change. They are moving away from command and control, and particularly male leaders at the highest levels. The senior male managers are moving toward collaboration, toward contributing to behind the scenes to the success of other people, and facilitating the success or mentoring other people. They're giving up command and control, except in unusual circumstances. And the curious thing about this is that those are styles that in the past have been associated with stereotypical female behavior. But if we look at the women in this study, we find that they are less willing to use collaboration and contributory behavior, and they very often are not mentoring people. They are doing what the men did 20 years ago.
Is that style, stage one, is stage two they're in?
It's stage two, and in a way it's understandable because women have come to leadership in corporate America late in the game, and those who entered 10 or 20 years ago saw men who were acting in what I call stage two fashion. They were using power, competition, and essentially doing it themselves. And those were the models that women saw of success in corporate America. And so they felt that's how they had to act in order to be accepted. And I think there's another aspect to this. I think women probably feel a little bit uncomfortable using collaboration and contributory and mentoring or facilitating or what we call vicarious behavior because they don't want to be seen as typical females.
Maternal.
Right.
Yeah.
But when a man does it, particularly at the highest level of the organization, people think he's a great guy.
Yeah.
They say, what a good guy. He doesn't have to do this. He could just tell us what to do. But instead, he's part of the team and he helps us and he's a mentor to us. And so that wears very well for, a new male style of leadership. And although that's the bad news, the good news for women is this, that because of the tremendous diversity that works simultaneously with this interdependent world, you have like a jigsaw puzzle of very different pieces that all have to fit together. To make those pieces fit together, you need political savvy. And women have somewhat more political savvy. According to our data, they are using styles that require political savvy.
Well, two of the women you mentioned here, Marcy Carsey certainly is a shining light in the entertainment world. Anita Roderick, and then interestingly, the woman connected with the Girl Scouts.
Frances Hesselbein.
Yeah.
I think all of these people understood the importance of diversity, what diversity brings, the excitement, the creativity that comes from rubbing together ideas and customs and perceptions of people who were brought up and trained and had experiences in very different worlds. It creates an excitement. Marcy Carsey said, and I quoted her in the book, she said, when we don't have diversity, we go out and we find diversity because that's what makes for creativity in the entertainment industry. There are a number of leaders who were interviewed for this book. Marcy Carsey and Frances Hesselbein, a marvelous woman who was the leader of the women's movement in Bulgaria, who was a member of parliament for many years. But Kerm Campbell from Herman Miller, and Robert Fisher from Schroeder Wertheim here in Los Angeles, and Mort Meyerson from Perot Systems. These were all people whom I interviewed. Lillian Gallo from Gallo Entertainment.
Age of these people, they have reached the top. Are they still competitive? Is that a part of them that has been subsided by their achievement, so they're willing to be more connective edge?
I think you put your finger on something very important. When you reach a certain level of satisfaction with yourself, when you feel you have achieved and you know that what you do well, most people are no longer, who have reached that level, are no longer competing against other people. They only compete against their own past performance.
Yeah.
So they look inward toward an internal standard of excellence, whereas people who are competitive have an external standard of
I think it's interesting, we're seeing with Bill Gates and Stephen Jobs that not a merger, but a collaboration a little with Microsoft and Apple. It has been pointed out to me that Microsoft had to do it so they didn't get into an antitrust situation, but whichever it is working, it is a progression, and it's constructive.
And I think that it tells you something about how the world has changed, because when Steve Jobs first started Apple, his philosophy that was even mirrored in the architecture of the Macintosh or the Apple was a standalone perspective.
Yeah.
The Apple stood alone. There, if you recall that famous or maybe infamous ad that they ran for 1984, it was that they were going to compete against the world, and they were going to stand alone. And one of the things that happened to Apple as a company was that they discovered that their most ardent supporters, and I count myself among them,
Yeah.
Nonetheless, at a certain point, realized they needed to be connected to other people. They needed to be able to send files back and forth to DOS-based or IBM machines. And this was one of the serious issues for Apple. And the fact that Apple and IBM and Apple and Microsoft would come together in these various collaborations. And what's interesting, before I mentioned short-term coalitions, they don't come together as partners across the board on everything, but they take selected dimensions of what they're doing and they cooperate on those. And I think that that is so characteristic of the connective era, where you work together, you collaborate, you reach out, you create alliances to work on this particular project. And